I'm Joan Cartan Hansen. Thank you for joining us. We're continuing our discussion about Idaho redistricting. Let's go to our first caller. Christy in Post Falls. Go ahead, Christy.
Hi. Hi, Joan. How are you?
I'm good. Go ahead.
Basically, there were, and I'm totally focusing on the North, which was totally ignored through the whole program other than what they called the North Idaho Compromise, which was basically the Lewiston, Moscow area. And we're up here in the Panhandle surrounded by Washington, Canada, and Montana, so we don't really have a whole lot of places to go.
Well, I apologize, Christy. We had a map that before we started going into the show, and then there were some problems and we didn't have time to fix it. So that's my fault.
Okay. But at any rate, there were two Republican incumbent senators and myself who drew maps that, to me, were better representative of communities of interest in the North, ignored by both parties. And as far as I'm concerned, and I think the other two senators would agree with me from the Republican Party, that they were done to protect existing incumbents. And that really frosts me.
Well, let me ask about that. Dan Popke from the Idaho Statesman did a fairly interesting article saying that if you looked at who was being pitted against whom, that the moderate Republicans were disproportionately being challenged by the plan, especially those Republicans who challenged Tom Lunas. Let me ask you about that. Were they the targets for this?
Actually, the two senators that on the Republican side that drew the maps are what I would consider moderate Republicans. In fact, one of them drew her district in an area I don't think she could get out of the primary. I think the right wing would take her out. One of them would survive, and one of them would get taken out by the right wing.
Well, Christy, let's let our guests talk.
Well, I think it was pretty clear that North Idaho, because of the geography, there's very few ways you could actually develop a map up there. I think if you look at what the Democrats proposed and what we proposed, there was agreement on that. Those two senators were pitted against one another. If you look at the first maps that came out, the RL34, the RL28 that originally came out, both the Republicans and Democrats had Dean Cameron and Denton Darrington pitted against one another in the Magic Valley.
Well, what about the idea that the moderate Republicans were being challenged, that the lines were being drawn to give the conservatives a greater chance? This wasn't so much about the Democrats as it was about the fractions within the Republican Party.
Let me just, because this isn't going to take long. Dan asked me if we were going to ring in and try to help the moderate Republicans, and I gave him all the answer he needed to hear. No, we're not. That's not something we want a part of.
Yeah. Well, and quite honestly, I developed that L34 map and never looked at the incumbent overlay until after Dan came back to me and said, why did you pit all of them? And I was like, huh? And honestly, I mean, I know people are, turn on their laughing machines, and I learned a valuable lesson that day, Joan. Every maps after that, I always looked at the incumbent layer, so at least I could answer the question, yes, I did realize who was there, and after a while, drawing as many maps as we did, we got to know where everybody was, but the numbers are the numbers, the geography is the geography, and I'll just stand by what we did. We had a former colleague of most of those guys on the commission with us, Evan Frazier, and he looked at it, and the numbers just worked the way they worked, and that's as simple as it is.
Let me ask you about, under Idaho law, they're not supposed to consider where incumbents are. That specifically says, don't do that. But you heard it all the time. Well, this is in this one's district, and this is right. Is there any way to not do it?
Joan, no. Before Gary answers, it doesn't exactly say that. It says we're not allowed to use that as a criterion. Not that we're not allowed to know.
No. Oh, no, and there's no way. Obviously, you have to know. Yeah.
But, exactly, and you're always going to get incumbents running against one another in redistricting. I mean, that pretty much goes without saying. And if you look at the turnover rates in legislatures, they're always much higher in that 2-year, and part of it is because incumbents wind up running against one another, or one incumbent winds up in a district where he or she knows they can't win, and so they don't even run, or they get beat. So that's part of the system. I mean, that's just part of the way it works.
Yeah, and I think the reality is because of the way the population grew in the state, with a major population growth in Ada County and Canyon County and Kootenai County and a little bit over in eastern Idaho, those matchups just developed that way. And over the top of that, even the other incumbents that if you look at it and just look at it, you'd say, well, they're probably going to be okay because they're in a district by themselves. Well, a lot of them are in essentially almost totally whole new districts just because of the geographic shifts. So, I mean, there's a lot of dynamics in this that unless you spent time as Commissioner Moses, and this is one of the great things that he did in all of the public hearings, he challenged people to go out, get on Maptitude, and try to at least create 7 districts at a minimum. Now, we were dealing with 35. And it was amazing how many people actually, the calls I got that said, yeah, I got to about 6 and, you know, I don't know how you're doing it, just go do it and take care of it because this is just insanity.
Or they get to 7 and say, it's a good thing I had to stop because I didn't know where to go after that. This is an interesting place, though, where some of these issues come together because you also get the urban-rural divide playing into this. 40%, the vast majority of the population growth in Idaho happened in Ada, Canyon, and Kootenai counties. Every place else, with one exception, Rexburg, because of what happened at BYU, Idaho, grew at a slower rate, or in some cases actually had fewer people than they had 10 years ago. Now, when you do that, it's a zero-sum game. If somebody gains, then somebody over here loses. Where somebody is gaining, it's kind of easy because there's no face on it. There's no body. But where somebody is losing, that's where the blood gets shed. And to go back up north, where Christy was talking about, the fact is, because you got to draw that line in Bonner County, there is no place else to draw it. That's fine, but because of where those senators live, you actually can play with that line, 1 or 2 precincts, either way, move them this way or that way. Could you, should you, would you? A lot of things go into that. I think someone sent me a scenario where we could have put one of those senators in 3 different districts with very little effort.
Well, there are a couple of issues I want to get to before we completely run out of time. One of them is shortly after, how long after did the chairman of the Republican Party take to submit present his press release?
Within moments.
It was just like, woof. It was saying, oh, we have to get rid of the commission. Should we get rid of the commission? They say obviously it didn't work, spent too much money, didn't work, we should get rid of it.
You know, that's I think a question for Chairman Semenko. I think that we expended a lot of time and effort trying to pull together consensus. I think in our petition, I think it's clear that we believe we can get to that consensus and actually develop a workable legislative map and a congressional map. So I would like more clarity again on what are those additional requirements so that a future commission can come in and be able to have a lot more certainty than what we had. I think what happened in with the last commission and the way some of the things developed there was a lot of questions that could have been answered at that point that really didn't get fully developed. And I'm hoping that this petition will serve as a great guideline for future commissioners. The other part of this too is that if Idaho doesn't go through the kind of growth that it went through in the last 10 years, what we do with this commission could have not only impact for the next 10 years, but could have significant impact even for the following 10 years after that. And so this is very important.
I would say that people who think we should go back to the legislature doing this need to go back and look at the recent history of when they did that, because it was not pretty. They were sued every time. They were sued every time except in the 90s. And in that 90 redistricting that they didn't get it done. They had an interim committee that went 4 or 5 months, did not come up with a plan. The plan didn't get done until the 1992 legislative session. And they took almost the entire first month of the legislative session to come up with a plan. So they wasted most of the legislative session, the first month of the legislative session, dealing with that. So
you go back to the
people
80s,
need
the
to
courts
the 80s. In the 80s, they were into it 3 different times.
And
they
the
lost
Floterial
3
districts.
lawsuits. They lost a suit in the 2 lawsuits in the 70s and 1 in the 60s. So I think people have forgotten what it was like to have the legislature do this.
And all of this proves that this isn't easy. But I mean, the fact is, there is at least one clear answer here. The Republican Party is clearly on record as wanting this process to go back to the legislature. It is in their platform. It's near the front. You can find it there.
Well, the Democratic Party chair issued his press release a little bit later, but basically saying, "We told you so. This is just the Republicans trying to do so the commission would fail." You know, not compromise. The commission would fail, and therefore they could come back and say we should eliminate the commission.
Well, that was political posturing on Larry Grant's part. I mean, that's a total crock. That was never even a consideration in what we were doing. We've been giving this the honest effort. If the party wants to change this and make changes in it, and the legislature wants to do it, that's their business. We had 3 Republican commissioners that were charged to develop a plan. That was the mission we were given. That's the mission we're going to complete. There was no effort on our part not to get a plan done, and I think if you look at the maps and look at the progress that was made on the maps, and I know there's been a lot of talk about how much ground the Democrats gave in terms of their compromise. Well, go look at our map where we started. We both gave a lot. We both put a lot on the table. We came very close in eastern Idaho. And I think working through, if I can just convince Commissioner Moses that downtown Eagle doesn't belong with downtown Boise, and we can actually reach an agreement on that, and I can see a map that when I say zoom in on Eagle, and that's not part of that district, then I think we're going to be able to get there.
Well, by the same token, Hidden Springs doesn't belong in the same district with Cascade, which was one of the maps that we got. No, there is
if you actually
could
solve it here now and save us all the trouble, I'd have you do it, but I want to get Gary. I don't think you can do it here. So in the next 2 minutes, let's see what.
Well, I just wanted to go back to something that Commissioner Moses said, which is this is not an easy process. People should try it, and I think that's absolutely true. This is far more difficult than people realize, and you know, some people in the public think that there were. And there are all kinds of hidden agendas here and there, but on the whole, this is a very difficult process, and we have 2 of the 6 commissioners here, and I would like to say publicly that I appreciate the work that you put into this, because it was a lot of work. I know that.
There's one other element here we haven't addressed. I mean, this all goes to who wants what, but if I didn't want this commission, if I wanted to see it fail, if I wanted to hamstring it, and I had at my disposal the law that was passed with the road rule and the precinct rule, I could do a lot worse. It would be a perfect tool for tying this commission in knots so that it couldn't get anywhere. And then you have in front of the public a failure, and then you say, well, what shall we do? The flaw in the commission structure is really very simple. There is a reason there are 9 justices of the Supreme Court. There is a reason there is a Speaker of the House and a President of the Senate who are empowered to break ties. Because if a tie is possible and can keep you from losing, you'll go for it. And it doesn't take thousands of years of parliamentary history to figure that out. And so we are saddled with a structure that assumes everybody wants the same thing and we'll get there. Well, faulty assumption.
Isn't there an assumption, though, that people can work together and come to consensus?
Well, but the reality is there are very few commissions that have an even number of people on them.
Throw a question, Betsy. Evan Fraser, the Republican chair, announced moments before everything finished that he might not be coming back, that it's been a great impact on his health.
That's right.
If he does not come back, how big of a change is that?
I think that will make a significant difference because he has a long history going back working on redistricting plans, even when the legislature was handling it for many, many years. He's a master technician at drawing the lines and making the pieces fit together, and it would change the dynamic if he were to be gone and a new commissioner were to come. That did happen 10 years ago. There was a commissioner who left and another was appointed, and so we could see some change in the dynamics here. I also wanted to return to a point that Commissioner Esposito made about if the party and the legislature wanted to change it and give it back to the legislature. Well, they're not the only ones who have a say. Not only would that require a 2/3 vote of the legislature, the people would have to approve that change at the next general election to give that job back to the legislature, and they're the ones who took it away. So that might not be the easiest.
The bloodbath of the 90s
and
resulted
no state has ever gone from a commission back to the legislature.
Because it really is ugly.
Well, you should go back and read the record on the adoption of the law that we're talking about with the road rule and that, because it's very clear from the debate that what the proponents wanted was a constitutional change, and it was equally clear that they had decided that wasn't possible. So this was going to be the next best thing.
All right. Well, I guess we'll wait and see until the Supreme Court does what it's going to do, and we'll be here to tell you what happened and where it's going to go next. So thank you for joining us for this Dialogue Web Extra, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate it.